Is this thing on?
Yeah, it's on. So welcome to the Rach and Nikki podcast. This is our very first episode. We have a really good one coming for you guys.
Yeah.
We have Lyle McDonald on.
Yeah. He was my first introduction into the nutrition and fitness evidence-based community, which is totally different from diet culture and all the typical dieting books that you see in Barnes and Noble.
We're going to be talking about menstrual cycles and all like the different phases, as well as birth control and like all the different types.
This episode is a lot about female stuff. So I think it's important for the guys out there too, because if you have sisters or girlfriends or wives or anything, these topics are really important for men to understand as well, because us women are very complicated creatures.
Yeah, like, comment, subscribe. Definitely any questions you have that you want us to answer, or because questions and concerns about your own body, drop it in the comments below, and we'll try to address it in further episodes.
Okay. So today we have on the podcast the man, the myth, the legend, Lyle McDonald. If any of you guys are in the nutrition and health field, you definitely know who he is. But Lyle, for anybody who doesn't know you, can you just give us a brief introduction?
Sure. So I've been doing this forever. Like I'm like the old man in the industry now. I got on the internet in 1993, coming out of college, a program in exercise science, for lack of a better way of putting it. Started writing. People seemed to like what I had to say. Basically, I was a frustrated mid-tier athlete looking to make himself better. That's kind of what it, and that drove me into the research, and people liked it. And I genuinely think I was one of the first people really pushing research-based anything online. That led into my first book in, I want to say, 1998 on low carbohydrate diets. And I've just been kind of cranking along since then. I think I've done 14 or 15 books now on all kinds of different topics, whatever kind of interests me at the moment. I'm very sure that I was the first person, this would have been 2004, to write formally about flexible dieting ideas, which nobody was ready to hear. It would take like another decade before that would be literally all that anybody would be talking about. Every 10 years or so, I do a book that nearly gives me a nervous breakdown. In 1998, it was the keto book, which was a monstrosity. 10 years later, I did this protein book that was another monstrosity. And in today, 10 years later, I did the women's book, volume 1, which was, I hate to use the word nightmare because it has such a negative connotation, but it was an exhausting book. For a number of reasons. Like, I'm glad I did it. I learned a million new things, which is always why I put myself through this. But yeah, so that was the most recent, like I said, monster book. So volume 2, maybe 2028 if we're lucky. I can't really get my head around the idea of doing that one just yet. But anyway, so that's the short version of what can be a long story.
Yeah, I think that you know more about women's bodies than I do from reading your book. Like, it's so in-depth. And
I've had a lot of women actually say that, even early on when I was sort of putting up introductory sections. And I realized I was starting from scratch. Like, I was starting from the terminology and moving forwards. And a lot of that, I mean, we could probably spend an hour. This stuff isn't taught. It's really just not to anybody, but not especially women, and I have done the occasional podcast, and usually this is kind of a cultural thing in many cultures, especially menstruation, and it's just not culturally normalized to talk about. And I think that's changing, but it's still, the information's just not out there. And so, yeah, I've had a number of women be like, yeah, you know how this works better than I do. And just because I spent 3 years reading a lot. So,
yeah. Well, we appreciate that, definitely, because it is hard to sift through all of that. So having it in a book, concise, is nice. So the first question I have for you is just if you could explain the menstrual cycle and the different parts of it, and also what are the differences between a normal female cycle and someone who is taking birth control?
Okie doke. So just as sort of a quick background, right? If you look at little boys and little girls, they're basically identical for all practical purposes. Like go look at toddlers, doesn't really matter. Puberty is when everything changes, right? That's when males under mainly testosterone lose fat, gain muscle, wide shoulders. That's when women start their menstrual cycle. And this is really kind of when the changes really start to appear. So by convention, the first day of menstruation, or sorry, first day of the menstrual cycle is defined as the first day of menstruation, the first day of bleeding. We typically say that the menstrual cycle is 28 days, and many women will report that it's 28 days, and for most women, it's actually not 28 days. A normal, and again, I hate to use the word normal, standard, I'll use as a different term, can be anywhere from 25 to 32 days. And if y'all want to chime in with what your experiences are, please do. For some women, they're like machines, right? They're like to the day, every month, every month. For other women, it can vary from shorter to longer. Frequently when girls start menstruating, it's the system's a little bit more unstable. Like it takes a little while for it to sort of come online and get in that sense. All right, so day one, first day of menstruation. I'm going to assume a 28-day cycle just because it's easier. That's split in at the halfway point by ovulation, day 14. That's when the egg is released. Okay, the first 2 weeks of the cycle are called the follicular phase. During that phase, the follicle, which is what contains the egg, is developing and forming, right? Follicular phase is from the follicle. And I'm going to jump forward and then back and talk about sort of what's going on. So then day 14, ovulation. The follicle explodes. That's the terminology. And I'm just imagining body producing the egg. And also then what's left of the follicle will form what's called the corpus luteum. And the second half of the cycle is called the luteal phase for that reason, corpus luteum, luteal phase. Then, so weeks 3 and 4, that luteal phase. And then assuming she has not become pregnant, we hit day 28, starts menstruating, and it all starts all over again. Okay, so that's the overall picture of the cycle. Now, the big things that are changing, and this is a lot of what makes women so much more complicated than men, right? If you're looking at a guy's hormones might as well be a flat line. Like real nitpickers will be like, during the month, during the day, there's a little fluctuation, during the week, during the month, during the year, over the lifetime. Yes, that occurs. It is not even remotely the same as what women are going through every month. Okay, so the two primary female hormones are estrogen and progesterone. In the first 2 weeks of the cycle, progesterone is essentially zero. It starts extremely low and maybe climbs up a little bit. Estrogen starts low at day 1, starts to increase. See this big spike about 3 to 4 days before ovulation, and that's part of what triggers the follicle exploding, and then it crashes. Ovulation has occurred. Now at that point, progesterone, which was starting low, starts to come up. That's because it's being produced predominantly by the corpus luteum. It sweeps up to day 21 through the first week of the luteal phase, week 3 of the cycle, before coming back down. Estrogen sweeps back up to maybe half as high as it was during the follicular phase. So it sweeps up and then it sweeps back down, right? So the overall pattern, estrogen starts low, spikes, comes down, comes back up, and there. Progesterone starts low ovulation, it climbs up and then climbs back down. Each of these hormones has different physiological effects. So in the follicular phase, and I'm going to use the phrase estrogen dominant, and I know that tends to be used in sort of somewhat alternative health practices in a little bit different context. I'll just say estrogen is the primary hormone during the follicular cycle because progesterone is just too low. It is doing things such as increasing insulin sensitivity, which increases the usage of carbohydrates for fuel. It's anti-inflammatory. Contrary to popular belief, it actually tends to enhance the use of fat for fuel to some degree in skeletal muscle. It is critical to helping women's muscles remodel from training. And there is, just jumping way forward, there is actually research that women get a better growth and strength response clustering more of their training in the first 2 weeks of the cycle. What's interesting to me is that estrogen is still kind of held up as the bad hormone for women. This is kind of this decades old idea. And if anything, estrogen's effects are predominantly positive.
Yeah, I always find that really interesting because you talked about that before, and in the functional medicine space, it's always like keep estrogen as low as possible. You want higher progesterone, which doesn't really make sense.
And if anything, it's exactly completely backwards. So progesterone, which again becomes the primary hormone in the second half of the cycle, causes insulin resistance, which can cause blood sugar fluctuations, can cause a little bit of protein breakdown. I don't know that it's necessarily inflammatory, but one thing about progesterone is not only does it have its own effects, it blocks the effects of estrogen. So it's basically also inhibiting the negative or the positive effects of estrogen. It actually directly stimulates fat storage in women's lower bodies. It's probably part of the increased appetite in the second half of the cycle. One thing, without getting too deep into the weeds, that's always been very difficult about determining the effects of these hormones. And also realize, like in mouse models, which get used a lot, it is exactly the opposite. And I wonder if that's where some of this idea about estrogen and progesterone is coming from. Anyway, so hang on, where was I going with that? So when you're looking at women's physiology, you have to ask, okay, is it estrogen? Is it the drop in estrogen? Is it progesterone? Is it the increase in, is it the progesterone to estrogen ratio? It gets really, like, they've spent decades figuring this out. And usually what they do is they use drugs to block a woman's hormone production completely and then put it back in and see what happens. So we, at this point in 2022, we have a pretty good idea. I guess I should mention women's testosterone levels generally very low. There's a little bit of a spike right around ovulation. I suspect that's to increase sex drive. I don't see why there would be another really good reason for it. Because, and as much as we're going to talk about fat loss and diet and appetite and stuff like that, you got to realize that the primary purpose of the menstrual cycle is for pregnancy and reproduction. Right? The first half of the cycle is just kind of prepping the system, egg gets released. The second half of the cycle is, so if she becomes pregnant, when you see like progesterone storing fat, her body wants to make sure she's got enough calories stored if she gets pregnant. One thing I should probably mention, you know, when every woman's experienced this, appetite tends to go up in the second half of the cycle. Cravings typically go up in the second half of the cycle. Body temperature goes up slightly, right? Like that's been the idea behind like basal body temperature measurements to try to track pregnancy cycles, which is okay. It's not really the best method. I think with apps now, we've probably gotten a little bit more accurate. So that second half of the cycle is her body going, okay, just in case, we're going to make sure and lay down, make her eat more, store those calories down in the hips and thighs, which are used preferentially to fuel childbirth and lactation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then if that doesn't happen, the corpus luteum, the endometrium gets broken down. Menstruation is simply the expulsion of that. I guess a question worth addressing, you know, why does a woman's body do that? Why not just keep it year round or keep it all the time? And it's because it uses a lot of energy. It's actually less energetically costly to break it down and rebuild it than to keep it around the whole time. So that's sort of the overall picture of the cycle. And part of the reason I sort of describe it in those terms is one of the things I talked about in the women's book, and it's part of what made it so complicated, is women have what I call hormonal modifiers, for lack of a better term, which is situations where one or the other hormones can be altered, lowered, changed, or what have you. And so I sort of tried to put them in terms of, all right, this is kind of an primary estrogen state, this is a primary progesterone state, et cetera, et cetera. We can maybe come back to that. Okay, so birth control. Birth control is abysmally complicated. That alone took me months. Okay, guys, I need you to go. Go, 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 go.
And also, real quick, to get into that as well, is a birth control induced cycle a real period?
Oh, you mean the bleeding that can occur?
Yeah.
Not exactly, but let me come back to that. Okay, we're talking about birth control. We have got a number of different forms, right? So we started with the pill, which was the first one back in late 60s, early 70s. The patch, which is applied here. You've got the implant, which is, I think it's either Implanon or Nexplanon. I think Next, which is a little plastic insert they put in the back of the arm. You got the Depo-Provera shot. You've got the ring, which is put within the uterus. And then you've got the hormonal IUD, which is just a standard metal IUD, but that it releases hormones locally. Guys, you're killing me. I have a new puppy and he doesn't ever stop playing. Okay, so those are the general types. For each, there is synthetic estrogen, which is typically ethinyl estradiol. There's another one that's not used, and lately there has been an increase in using bioidentical estrogen. I think there's only one form of that right now. That's the easy bit, because then we get to the synthetic forms of progesterone, of which there are, at last count, about 12. Okay, guys, enough. Get out. That are divided into 4 generations based on when they were produced, that to one degree or another work like a woman's natural progesterone. So they can have wildly different effects. The most current generation, which is drospirenone, found in like Yaz and Yasmin, which you might be familiar with, is the most similar to a woman's natural progesterone. And a lot of women love that for a number of reasons. Okay, so we've got the synthetic estrogen, the synthetic progesterone. All right. Hormonal birth control comes in either a combined form that has both. There are some synthetic progesterone only forms. Way back in the day, they used something called the mini pill. And it's for women that I guess can't tolerate estrogen. That gets into a little bit of medical stuff. The Depo-Provera shot, which I will forever and evermore, I think should be taken off the market. Of all of the kinds of hormonal birth control, it has the single worst set of side effects in terms of, what's that?
That's the
Depo-Provera shot.
And that's
which is
generation progesterone?
Yeah, and that's what blows me away. 50 years after it was developed, they are using a high potency synthetic long-acting progestin. And why no one has been able to develop something newer is beyond me. And I only have to guess is that whenever they produced it, they made like 1 billion doses and they haven't run out. Like I don't know honestly why they haven't developed something better. Its only advantage is that it's quick and easy. It's boom, you get a shot and you don't have to worry about it for 3 months. But it has the highest risk of weight gain. It can like something like doubles the risk of obesity. It can cause bone mineral density loss. If you've ever known women that, and yeah, there'll be women that have no negative response. When women come off it, it takes months and months for them to return to any sense of normalcy. It's just nasty, nasty, nasty. It's just convenient. The Implanon implant is progestin only. The patch, I believe, is combined and the ring is combined. The hormonal IUD is really kind of sits outside these. All these other forms of birth control release the hormones into the bloodstream. The hormonal IUD is essentially purely local. It's releasing a synthetic progestin only in the uterus. So it's not really impacting on overall blood hormone levels. One more element, and this is only oral birth control. There are multiple forms of that. There's what's called monophasic birth control, where the synthetic estrogen, synthetic progesterone are kept at the same level the entire time. You've got diphasic, where the progestin is increased halfway through. You've got triphasic, where it goes up, 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 and down, where they're trying to sort of mimic that natural hormone cycle. And there's a new one called quadriphasic that nobody seems to know anything about the last time I looked. In practice, they either use monophasic or triphasic. What's kind of interesting in that regard is when you start looking at things like fat gain, body composition changes, even athletic performance, it's always the triphasic that have the worst effects. And it's because of that high level of progestin in week 3. All right, so like I said, we've got like 5 different types. You can have combined or progestin only, and oral can be monophasic or triphasic. It's it's brutal in terms of the complication. And then there's one other thing I want to mention, just because I think it's an interesting bit of trivia. We have typically, yeah, you know, when I took it, typically birth control, hormonal birth control has been used in like a 3-on-1 off pattern, right? That's been the traditional way of using like oral birth control, the patch, the ring. And you asked, you know, what about that, the final week of bleeding? It's not, because you're not getting an endometrium, you're not getting a development of the endometrium. So it's not a real period in the sense of it's not expelling the endometrium, but it's just, it's a recovery bleed. But here's the interesting thing. There's actually no physiological rationale for that 3-on-1 off pattern. This wasn't in the women's book. I didn't realize this till I started. And then I told a female friend of mine this, and she's just like, duh. When they were developing birth control, the physicians of the day felt that women would find it more normal if they bled once a month. And that's the only reason the 3-1 pattern exists. In recent years, there's been a real push for just continuous use of birth control. That using it for months, there's no reason to have that withdrawal week, to have the week of placebo pills or going off of it. I don't know if the patch and the ring are being used continuously, but I don't see why they wouldn't be. Like basically that week off puts women at a higher risk for pregnancy. There's just no real reason for it. It was just a leftover from, God, 70 years ago, 60 years ago. So, and again, I told a female friend of mine that. She's like, yeah, duh. I'm like, what do I know? I'm just a dumb boy. Like, I don't know this until I read it. Somebody tells me. But that is the complexity of birth control. And I've never been quite clear on why physicians or OBGYNs prefer one or the other. I don't know if it's just personal preference. I don't know if there's some sort of scheme they're using to determine what might be better or worse for a given woman. I do know, which one is it? So combined oral birth control with 2nd-generation progestins has a slightly lower risk of things like clots and embolism than 3rd generation. The risk is very small to begin with. I mean, I know that sounds dismissive, right? Any woman who's had one will listen to this and go, that guy's like, if you experience it, a small risk doesn't matter. And it's usually in folks that are smokers or have other health risks. So it seems like whenever I hear from women on in my forum or online, if they're given oral birth control, it tends to be 2nd-generation progestins. Like I said, the 4th generation, which uses drospirenone, is the one that's most like a woman's natural progesterone. And women love it because one of the things I didn't mention about progesterone's effects, it does cause a little bit of water loss. It does actually clear up women's skin. Progesterone blocks the effects of testosterone in a woman's body. So Yaz tends to do that. Drospirenone tends to have, it just acts more like a woman's natural progesterone. Like I said, they're also starting to use bioidentical estradiol because the synthetic form does some funky things when it's metabolized in the liver. And I kind of hate the appeal to natural, whatever that, appeal to nature, but it does make logical sense to me that putting in a woman's normal estrogen that's not a synthetic is probably going to have less negative effect. Like it, not that it, I don't know. Like I said, there's just a certain logic to that to me. Unfortunately, there is no bioidentical oral form of progesterone yet. For whatever reason, like even if you talk about menopause, when they use bioidentical progesterone, it usually has to be applied. I think it's either as a cream or intravaginally. They'll probably fix that down the road. And I suspect that will be the future of hormonal birth control. So that's, like I said, so that's sort of the broad overview. And what you do see, again, ignoring the hormonal IUD, is that birth control basically will, for lack of a better phrasing, take over a woman's hormone levels in the sense that when you're replacing them synthetically, this will decrease a woman's production of her own hormones. And so basically you're controlling it, again, for lack of a better word, with what's, and it's, an easy example, when men take anabolic steroids, when they take synthetic forms of testosterone, same thing, their bodies stop producing testosterone because they don't need it. They got plenty coming in from a needle or a pill or whatever. Same sorts of things. Again, the hormonal IUD is not doing that. So a woman will still have a menstrual cycle. She will still have hormonal shifts. It's a purely local thing, which may or may not be good depending on what the goal is, right? Because as much as birth control is frequently used for, its primary intended use to predict, it's for women that have really harsh menstrual cycles, especially if they've got severe PMS. I guess I probably should have talked about that. PMS occurs, it's week 4. That second half of the luteal cycle is typically PMS week, where a woman might experience mood swings, emotional lability. Some will go so far as to have like suicidal ideation. Water gain typically occurs there. Sleep is impaired. Cramping may start. Cramping is really more of the preparing to sort of get rid of the endometrium, and a whole host of other things. And for women that have it so severely, it's called premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Like I said, can be physically incapacitated with pain, may suffer suicidal ideation because they get so depressed that they're prone to that. A nurse practitioner I know actually for her patients will give an antidepressant for 1 week out of the month, specifically for that reason. So everyone in that situation, birth control may be a way to simply regulate a cycle that is really causing them problems. So in that case, you're basically just using the external hormones to just control levels. Even athletes may do that. And the athletic performance thing is a whole separate issue, and there's huge variance. Some women have no real change throughout the month, and others it's up and down and up and down. Well, imagine that you're an elite athlete and you have trained your entire life, and your world championships or your Olympics or whatever it is fall on your worst week of the month. Well, tough. You don't get to reschedule it.
Yeah.
Or even if you're a weight class athlete and it's in the week of the month where you're holding, 3 more pounds of water. Well, too bad. Frequently, birth control will be used in that situation simply to make sure that doesn't happen to regulate the cycle. Again, the hormonal IUD doesn't do any of that. So pros and cons depending on what the goals are.
And does birth control affect testosterone as well?
Yes. And this is something that I think tends to go kind of unappreciated, is that most forms of female birth control will lower women's testosterone levels by about half through a number of mechanisms, which aren't really worth getting into, but there is a significant difference. And I have a feeling, right, because we know that something like 25% of women will get sexual dysfunction of some sort from birth control, like total loss of interest in sex, whatever it is. So women's testosterone levels range from about 30 to 70 nanograms per deciliter. Men's range from 300 to 1100. It's like 10 to 30 times more. My gut says that if you have a woman who, say, has a testosterone of 50 or even 30, and you cut that in half, she's now like a guy that has a testosterone of 150. Whereas if you take a woman who's got a testosterone of 70 and cut that in half, she's still, that's my hunch. I have no data to support that, but I suspect that's what's going on. So it does reduce testosterone, and that can get into the whole question of athletic performance, and the data on that is really all over the place, depending on the form, depending on what they're looking at. A lot of the data is just fundamentally terrible. I see the way they do these, because they'll do these studies and they're like, all right, we took 10 women who are all on different forms of birth control. And then we'll take the data and we'll just stick it up, we'll average it. And it's like, well, different forms of birth control do different things. Given that something like 50% of women are on birth control at any given time, I find it hard to believe that they couldn't go to a university and find 10 women on the same form of birth control. That just seems like lazy study. Or occasionally they'll take women and put them on a specific form. But the data tends to be pretty miserable in that sense. But there is the potential, I think, that it could decrease either acute performance or adaptations to training. Even that, without getting into that Depends on your goals. And I did write a little ebook on this because I couldn't face another big book about birth control and athletic performance. And I talked about this. When birth control has a negative effect, it's typically fairly small. It's like 5 or 10%. Even one of the big studies they did that was looking at muscle gain. Over 8 weeks, women not on birth control gained a kilo of muscle, about 2 pounds. Sorry, women on birth control gained about a kilo. Women not on birth control gained 1.5 kilos. So they gained 1 pound more, 2 versus 3 pounds. Now, for any given woman, does it matter? If you're an elite power lifter, an elite Olympic lifter, an elite athlete, yeah, probably. Does that matter to the average female trainee who may very well be very serious? Does that 1 pound difference over 8 weeks? Does that 5% difference in her aerobic performance? In the big picture, does that matter? Probably not. So it may very well be that the benefits of birth control and that for whatever use, I guess I should mention just because, and I'll occasionally make these really inappropriate comments. But this is, again, it's all science. Don't blame me. I'm just the humble reporter. Many women will use, or someone will use birth control to, how can I put this without being too crass? To control their menstrual cycle so that they're not in a bad part of their cycle for like vacations and special events. And I'll just leave it at that. And I think everyone else can figure out what I'm getting at. So yeah, so for any given woman, it's just kind of a matter of, these are the potential cons. These are the potential pros. Another potential pro of birth control, on top of just regulating the cycle, women who are prone to anemia due to blood loss, and some women have very heavy cycles and lose more iron, birth control can help to treat that. So there are other reasons that it might be used other than just to prevent pregnancy. And again, for any given woman, it just depends on what her goals are, what her specifics are, et cetera, et cetera. But don't use Depo-Provera. Seriously, I'm so. And I know some OBGYNs are saying, they're like, yeah, absolutely, it should be off the market. Anyway, so that's a brief overview of birth control. Like I said, it's, and the other thing, and then I will move on, they're developing new ones all the time. So, and there's frequently very little data on it. I mean, people have made the point, for right or for wrong, hormonal birth control represents like the single longest, basically, experiment on women that's ever been done. Because, I mean, you can't really know the long, we probably do now, like 50 years down the road, but the forms of birth control they're used in the 70s are rarely used anymore. And they've really, if you go back to the 70s, they would put like 150 micrograms of synthetic estrogen in the pill. They use about 15 to 25 now. They've realized that you can bring the dose down to much, much, much smaller amounts and still have the same benefits. Same thing, the synthetic forms of progesterone, they're trying to find forms that have as good of a effect in terms of preventing pregnancy with less side effects. So 5 years from now, we may have an entirely new approach to this that avoids a lot of these earlier problems.
How can women eat and train to sync with their menstrual cycles?
Okay. So let me go back a little bit. I talked about some of the physiology, right? Now let me say, right, some podcast I talked about this, and to a degree, we can get a little bit over-focused on details. But at the same time, we are seeing shifts in a woman's physiology over the menstrual cycle in terms of how she utilizes carbohydrates, her appetite, and I'll come back to that, don't we forget in this little section, cravings, etc., that do need to be factored in or should at least be considered. So in the first half of the cycle, again, follicular phase, estrogen is the primary hormone. Woman is insulin sensitive, tends to use carbohydrates very well for fuel. One interesting thing, again, I'll try to make this as least crass as possible. One of the other things estrogen does is it blunts appetite. And what you see is that in those 3 to 4 days right before ovulation, women have the least appetite for like food and drink. And there was a researcher that proposed, because it's seen this in animals, that the reason that her desire for food and drink was lowered is so that her desire for other, shall we say, pleasures of the flesh would be increased.
Right.
because that's what she's in her. And then they did data on that, and they in human women, and found that when hunger appetite is up, sex drive, and vice versa. So it's like it's absolutely true, and again, it makes absolutely logical sense in an evolutionary terms. So this is actually in the most general sense. This is when, like I said, her body will tolerate carbohydrates to the best degree, and having a slightly higher carbohydrate intake to fuel training. It's probably a good thing with relatively lower fat percentage. I tend to set protein about the same. I'm sure y'all have seen or found in your cell or who you've worked with, many women don't eat enough protein, and even that has a biology to it. Men tend to crave protein and fat. Men love ketogenic. Men love low carb diets. I get to eat burgers and bacon. Oh yeah, men are all over it. Women are more prone to crave carbohydrates and fats. And then add to that just early upbringing. If you're not raised eating a lot of meat, you tend not to have as much of a taste for it. So I tend to set protein fairly static, and then we're mainly looking at carb. But because appetite tends to be blunted the best for women who are going to start a fat loss diet, it should be in those first 2 weeks, for the simple fact that that will be give her the greatest likelihood of succeeding. That's all separate. There's even data, I've looked into it, even when they're trying to quit drinking or smoking or drugs of abuse, when she starts in her cycle can actually really affect success rates because of these. So like that shows you how profound these hormonal differences are and how ignored they tend to be.
Yeah.
So as we enter the second half of the cycle, progesterone starts to become the primary hormone. Women becomes insulin resistant, and many women find that their blood sugar gets a little funky, and they may see spikes and crashes. She's not going to tolerate carbohydrates as well. Even though I said that fat storage can be increased, and that's true, when you're insulin resistant, use a little bit more fat for energy during exercise. So shifting carbohydrates down a little bit and fats up a little bit during that phase has potential benefits. And here, I mean, I'm talking 5 or 10, like 10% in either direction, right? Like it might be, say, 25% protein all the way through. Carbs might be 55% with 25% fat in the first half of the cycle, and 45% and 30 to 30. Like we're not talking about these, massive shifts. Another thing that happens that I sort of didn't mention is appetite and cravings go up in weeks 3 and 4. And it may be due to the falling estrogen, it may be due to the increasing progesterone, kind of doesn't matter. And when food is uncontrolled, appetite, calorie intake may go up by like 300 to 500 calories per day. At the same time, there's also a slight increase in metabolic rate, but it's only about 100 to 300 calories per day. And it's very, if a woman is not tracking or controlling things. Just as a super weird bit of trivia I found. Are y'all both in the US?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in the US, we typically think of typical period cravings as chocolate, but there's actually a cultural component to that. And I found some weird paper somewhere that actually in Spain, women tend to eat savory foods when they're on their, like chicken and stuff. And a lot of that seems to be pretty much just culturally programmed, right? You're a young girl, you're in that, and your mom goes, here, eat this, you'll feel better. And it just sort of, and that, so it's more of a tradition than a biology for whatever reason, but the cravings are there regardless. All right, go ahead.
Real quick, I had a client once who had such terrible cravings for just food in general, but a lot of processed foods, her 4th week, that her caloric intake went up by like 1,500 calories.
Wow.
Yeah, and I'd never experienced that before. I was
huge.
Yeah, so and it would be like true binges. And she just every single month it would be the same thing, and she was totally able to. She never had that the other weeks, so that kind of was puzzling for me because I didn't think that those fluctuations could be that large.
That's, I mean, certainly higher than I've ever seen. And, one issue with research is that they're just taking these average values, and that can frequently eliminate the outliers. And actually, after I finish this, I want to make, I'm surprised y'all, a question that always comes up, what about birth control and weight gain? That's like, you see that all. And I do want to, let me touch on that because it sort of points out where the averages can be very misleading. All right, so I sat down and I mapped this whole thing out. Like, all right, first 2 weeks, a little bit higher carbs, a little bit lower fats. Second 2 weeks, a little bit lower carbs, a little bit higher fats, which should help to control appetite. And then somebody actually did a research study on exactly that. And they compared, it was like the Dutch or Swedish, like standard nutritional guidelines, which are just like regular US nutritional guidelines, to they called it the menstrual study. And they basically set up the diet and training to some degree to match the menstrual cycle phase. And they did exactly what I laid out, which it's always nice to see when my theoretical ramblings actually like match up with the real world. And what they found was that it did work better in the sense that adherence was much better. Because of course, again, at a fundamental level, taking these things into account is going to be better than either pretending they don't exist or flat out or being unaware of them, or just flat out trying to ignore them. And on a completely different topic, I've talked about this in other podcasts, and some women just have their performance crater in week 4. It just is what it is. And if they're extremely driven and extremely motivated, there's very much often I can just fight my way through this, right? When I was younger, I was coaching a female athlete, and I was a dumb boy. I didn't know any of this stuff. And 1 week out of every 4, she just like, I can't lift this weight. And I'm like, what do you mean? Lift the weight. She's like, you can't do it. I'm like, what do you mean? Lift the weight. And then I finally got my head out of my rear end and started looking. I was like, oh, and I put the pattern together, and I was like, all right, week 1 blows it out of the water. Week 2, a little weaker. Week 3, after that testosterone. Week 4, forget it. And I started programming or training like that. But unless you're going to use birth control to modulate hormones or whatever, like you can't, I hate to use the word fix because it implies something's broken. I don't want that to come up. Like you can't change a woman's menstrual cycle unless you use, you can try to work against it. And the women in week were like, I must just go train my brain. Like, no, if it's not there, it's not there. There's nothing you can do about it. Or you can work with it. And that's what this study found. Now, one of the other things it did that I thought was interesting is, so if a woman's metabolic rate has gone up by a few hundred calories during weeks 3 and 4, there's kind of two ways to look at that. One, again, we're assuming fat loss here. If you keep your calories locked to where they were, you should get a little bit more fat loss, right? Your deficit should be a little bit larger. Alternately, and this is what the study did, is if you've got a woman who's really suffering from cravings, you can fit in a little bit more. And actually what this study did is that they allowed the woman, if they really needed, they could have like 200 grams of dark chocolate or something rough. Like basically it was like, if you want to fit that in during weeks 3 and 4, since it will help you with adherence, that's something to consider, which is even super interesting. I read this book, oh my goodness, it's been 20 years ago, by a female nutritionist whose name I now forget. And it was called Why Women Need Chocolate. And it was looking at the biological reasons that we've heard magnesium, opioids, sugar. I don't know if it's ever really been determined, but it doesn't matter. Her point was, look, if you've got this biological craving, you can either fight it and end up with your face in the bag of chocolate, or you can allow it in controlled fashion. And that's kind of the approach the study took. And I think I mentioned that in the book too, which is, I just want to say that I've now given, scientifically, medically approved chocolate intake in the second half of the cycle. I just want to make sure I get credit for that. But I'm basically saying medically, this is appropriate. So far as it's really interesting, you mentioned that client. One of the things I didn't talk about, which again, during the menstrual cycle, those mood swings, all that stuff that often happens in week 4, as estrogen and progesterone crash, not only do you often see a water weight regain, like that's the worst part of the cycle that's going to happen, but a lot of this is falling serotonin and dopamine levels are both occurring at that point because of the hormonal changes. And I think if you have someone who's maybe prone to binge eating, if you get a big drop in brain dopamine, they're going to start getting that big reward trigger from processed foods.
That makes sense, yeah.
That's probably, and also serotonin, which is a super weird neurochemical, is sort of generally inhibitory, right? Like low serotonin is related to depression, anxiety, bipolar, aggression. And it's not that it causes any of these things, but if you're prone to them, when serotonin drops, it allows them to sort of express themselves. So women who are prone to, when serotonin drops in week 4, they may express that or whatever it is. So I think it's the drop in both of those that are probably, she's not only getting a bigger reward from those foods, but her overall self-regulatory abilities are probably decreased because of that neurochemical change. And it is just kind of one of those things. And it might require, and I mentioned some supplements in the book that can be used to sort of address that. 5-HTP for serotonin. I mentioned Vitex Cagnus for dopamine, which has been used in women's health treatment for probably centuries at this point, which works a little bit through dopamine, or it might actually require, pharmaceutical intervention to really, if it's that. I'm curious, does she experience any of the other like super hard negatives during that week 4, like incapacitating cramps, suicidal ideation, like any of, or is it just the eating?
Well, it's hard for me to know because she was on certain medication for like depression and
Okay.
anxiety. So I don't know if that was controlling any of that, but
Got
I do know that a lot of it was like related to her physiology too. Like if she wasn't able to consume a higher caloric intake, she would get extremely fatigued, extremely irritable, a lot of those.
Okay. But yeah, and even that, it points out the variability in women, especially compared to men. Like I said, if I'm coaching a guy, I have the same dude walking in the gym every day. With a woman, it may be changing, right? We are, sort of as I described, we've got these broad changes every 2 weeks, and there's even the more subtle changes in every week. And it may be changing her physiology to a lesser or greater degree. Some women I've seen performance-wise, no change. Some women have never experienced PMS. And I don't know, I've heard stories at least that those, because if you never experienced it, you're just like, yeah, doesn't exist. It's like, well, no. Or if you want to get into a lot of fringe stuff in the US, I guess PMS has now become a made up thing that is used by the patriarchy. I don't want to go down this road. This is not a conversation. But where some of this is coming from. Like something like 30% of women experience PMS. The majority, cramps is probably the most common effect, and that's physiological. Like 10% experience severe premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So it's not universal. The appetite things are not universal. So any given woman, there can be huge changes. Like I said, I had a trainee who would literally go from week 1, personal bests. She would just put up all the weight. Week 2, a little bit weaker. Week 3 would come back up. Week 4, when I finally figured it out, she couldn't do more than 60% of her maximum on machines. Her coordination went out the window. Everything, just her entire training just completely went down. And so we would just go play on the machines for a week. And then literally, as soon as she started menstruating, boom, it was on. And she could go in that day and put up a personal best. I once saw, at one point we were doing 2-a-day training. And we've been doing this for a while, right? So we train her in the morning and then come back in the afternoon. And that morning she was like day 28. And it was just terrible. Wow. At lunch, she started menstruating. And that afternoon, she put up it was a switch. It's not true for all women. Some women, it takes 2 or 3 days before they feel that. Women have reported Olympians world records in every week of the cycle, although self-reported cycles are incredibly, it's remembered about as well as food records. Like older research that you read, they had women just self-report their menstrual cycles. The data is worthless. Nobody remembers any of this stuff well. Not just, like I said, not harping on just that stuff. Food records, we're all terrible at it. Now when they do studies, you have to use like ovulation kits, hormone record to actually get anything that matters. But for any given woman who's listening to this, either as her own trainee or if you're coaching women, I can speak in generalities, but everyone will be somewhat different. And to a great degree, you have to keep your own records and kind of be your own scientist to figure out your own personal cycles. And once you do, whether it's eating, right? So your client, you found, all right, week 4, things kind of go off the rails. Did you ever find a solution?
So what I told her was, eat however much you want, but it has to be whole unprocessed foods, just to keep
Okay.
the caloric intake a little bit lower.
Sure.
That was definitely helpful. And then I said, because she did go for like the Ben and Jerry's and the processed stuff, but
Right.
it was more so an issue of food, the amounts of food that she was eating, that she would just crave more and more. So that was kind of like my solution to it.
Gotcha. Okay. Which, and again, it's a matter of just working within those parameters. And same thing with the training. If a woman finds that week 4, everything, go do something else. Go in, do light workouts for women who are competitive athletes. Typically, you see week 4 as an easy week anyway. Well, that's a good recovery week. Go in, you just do other things, do what you can do. And then when you've got it, you can go destroy yourself and whatever you want to do in the gym. Like I said, I did also mention there is several pieces of research now that clustering more training in the first 2 weeks of the cycle when estrogen is primary gives women larger strength and muscular gains than clustering in the second half due to progesterone's effects. Like, not that you don't get any in the second half, but certainly a woman's body is more primed to get beneficial results from those first. So you can start to overlap all kinds of patterns like this, where you may see that week 1, 2, 3, 4 vary somewhat, and week 1 and 2 you're going to sort of put a little bit higher amounts of training, and then week 3, maybe if food intake is a problem, all right, maybe we're going to raise cardio a little bit to try to give a little calorie buffer, assuming it doesn't stimulate hunger. And then in week 4, for many women, you know what? All bets are off. It will really very much depend on the woman, but get a couple months of records. Now there's a million apps that allow this to be tracked, whether it's, energy, mood, performance. Actually, the study I saw, they took, I think it was adolescent soccer players, and they just had them do the same workout for an entire month and had them log things like rating of perceived exertion, how hard it was, fatigue, energy, mood, to try to start to identify their own personal patterns. I am thankful. I don't know how coaches of like female team sports do it. I don't know how you could. I mean, I've had female friends that went into the military. Apparently they put them all on birth control for exactly that reason, because they just want everyone to be just on a level ground, for right or for wrong. But yeah, doing that for a couple months, determining your own pattern, will start to identify where the problem areas are, if there are any, and then you could start addressing solutions like what you came up with in terms of the eating thing, like the exercise thing. Or, if you're okay with it, it's really a problem, well, go on a long-term birth control, hormonal birth control, and just flatten it out and just be done with it.